The first thing that struck me was the absence of sound. Not quiet, not hush, but a total erasure, as if the world had pressed mute on itself. When I stepped down from the shuddering prop plane, the snow beneath my boots didn't crunch. It absorbed me. The air was so cold it felt like it might shatter if I exhaled too hard. My breath fogged in front of me, then vanished, leaving me alone with the depot. The depot itself looked like something left behind by a vanished civilization. Rusted tanks, their paint peeled away by decades of wind, hunched in the snow like ancient bones. Pipes snaked between them, half buried, leading to squat buildings with windows so frosted over they reflected nothing. The sky was a bruise of purple and blue, never quite day, never quite night. 4 hours of this dim light was all we'd get, and already I felt it pressing down on me. I tried to focus on the others. There were 6 of us, counting myself. The crew chief, Griggs, was a bear of a man, with a beard that looked like it had been grown for warmth, not style. He barked orders with the authority of someone who'd spent too many winters out here. Carter, our mechanic, was younger than me but seemed older, his eyes already distant. The geologist, Dr. Sato, wore glasses that fogged up instantly, and she muttered to herself in Japanese when she thought no one was listening. There was also Lena, the environmental tech, and a pair of twins, Eric and Anders, who spoke in clipped Norwegian and always seemed to be sharing private jokes. I kept my head down, lugging my duffel toward the main building. My hands ached inside my gloves. I was here to prove myself, to erase a mistake that had cost me my last job and nearly my career. This place was supposed to be a fresh start, but already it felt like a punishment. Inside, the warmth was artificial, dry and stinging. The walls hummed with the effort of ancient heaters. Griggs laid out the rules. Keep the tank heaters running, check the gauges every 4 hours, log any leaks or spills, and, above all, never go outside alone after dark. He said it like it was gospel, and nobody questioned it. That first night, I couldn't sleep. The wind moaned against the walls, but it was the silence between gusts that unnerved me most. I lay in my bunk, listening to the building settle and the pipes groan. At one point, I heard a sound beneath the floor, slow, deliberate, like someone knocking from below. I told myself it was just the ice shifting, the ground adjusting to the cold. Dr. Sato called it frost heave when I brought it up at breakfast, waving her hand dismissively. But I noticed she avoided my eyes. There were other oddities. The way voices echoed strangely in the corridors, as if the walls were listening. The food tasted faintly metallic, no matter what I ate. The twins insisted on lighting a candle before bed, muttering something in Norwegian that sounded like a prayer. Lena laughed at them, but I found myself watching the flame flicker, comforted by its small defiance against the dark. On the second day, I walked the perimeter with Carter. We checked the tank valves, our breath hanging in the air like ghosts. He told me about the wolves, how sometimes they came close, drawn by the scent of fuel or maybe just curiosity. I asked if he'd ever seen one. He shook his head, but his lips pressed tight. That evening, as twilight faded, I stood outside and looked out over the endless white. The depot was a tiny island in a frozen sea. The cold was so deep it felt personal, as if it wanted to hollow me out and fill me with ice. Somewhere far off, a howl rose and fell. It might have been a wolf, or not. I went to bed with my boots beside me, just in case. The knocking under the floor started again, louder this time, and I pressed my pillow over my ears. I tried to remember the rules. Never go outside alone after dark. Keep the heaters running. Log everything. I wondered if the rules were meant to protect us, or to keep something in. Sleep came slowly, tangled with uneasy dreams. I woke once to the sound of footsteps in the hall, but when I looked, there was no one there. Just the pale light of the emergency exit sign, flickering, as if struggling to stay awake. By the end of that first week, the silence had seeped into my bones. The depot felt smaller every day, the darkness heavier. I found myself listening for the knocking, waiting for it, as if it were a message meant only for me. And always, the sense that something was listening, just beneath the ice. The days blurred together, a cycle of dim light and endless night. I tried to keep my mind busy, checking valves, logging temperatures, recalibrating sensors, but the monotony only made the strangeness more pronounced. The depot's routines were supposed to anchor us, but they felt more like rituals, performed to appease something unseen. The knocking beneath the floor became a constant companion. Sometimes it was a single hollow thud, other times a pattern that almost seemed to mimic footsteps. I'd pause, heart thudding, waiting for it to stop. It never did. The others pretended not to notice, but I caught them glancing at the floor, their expressions tight with unease. One afternoon, Eric and Anders argued in low voices near the generator shed. Their words were sharp, clipped, but I couldn't make out the meaning. When I approached, they fell silent, their eyes darting away. I tried to shake off the feeling that secrets were growing between us, like frost spreading in the cracks of old concrete. That evening, I sat with Lena in the control room, watching the security feeds. The cameras showed only endless white and the hunched shapes of the tanks. But as the twilight deepened, something flickered across the screen, a shadow gliding beneath the surface of the ice, long-limbed and distorted. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but Lena saw it too. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the monitor. "Did you see that?" she whispered. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. "Probably just a reflection," I said, though I didn't believe it. We rewound the footage, frame by frame. The shape was there, unmistakable, a figure moving beneath the ice, its outline warped by the frost. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the darkness. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind clawed at the walls, and the knocking grew louder, more insistent. I pressed my ear to the floor, half expecting to hear voices. Instead, I heard a faint rhythmic tapping, almost like Morse code. I tried to convince myself it was just the ice shifting, but the pattern felt deliberate, purposeful. At breakfast, I mentioned the camera footage. Griggs dismissed it with a grunt. "Ice does strange things to light out here," he said, not meeting my eyes. Dr. Sato agreed, but her hands trembled as she stirred her coffee. The twins said nothing, their faces pale. Carter tried to lighten the mood, telling a story about a polar bear that wandered into a camp years ago. But even his laughter sounded forced, brittle. No one lingered after the meal. Later, I reviewed the audio logs from the tank monitors, searching for anything unusual. Most of the recordings were static and mechanical hum, but one file made me freeze. Through the hiss, I heard my name, soft, insistent, unmistakable, Alara, over and over, like a lullaby. The voice was familiar, achingly so, my mother's voice, gentle and warm, calling me from somewhere deep below the ice. I slammed my laptop shut, my hands shaking. My mother had been gone for years, lost to the kind of silence that never lifts. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, a product of isolation and exhaustion. But the sound lingered in my head, impossible to shake. That evening, the generator failed for the first time. The lights flickered, plunging the main building into a heavy gloom. We scrambled to restart it, fumbling with tools and flashlights, our breath clouding the air. When the power returned, the security feeds were filled with static. For a moment, I thought I saw faces in the snow, pressed against the glass, watching us with cold, patient eyes. Lena caught my arm as we left the control room. "Do you ever feel like we're being watched?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every minute," I admitted. We tried to laugh it off, but the sound died quickly. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it a chorus of howls, some animal, some not. The depot felt smaller, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Communication with Barrow grew worse. Our radio calls dissolved into static, punctuated by bursts of garbled speech that sounded almost like words, but not quite. Griggs insisted we keep trying, but each failed attempt left us more isolated, more adrift. The rules became our lifeline. Check the heaters, log every anomaly, never go outside alone after dark. But the rules felt increasingly arbitrary, as if they were meant to distract us from the truth. Something was moving beneath the ice, watching, waiting. On the third night, I woke to find my room colder than usual. The window was rimmed with frost, the glass warped by the cold. I pressed my palm against it, staring out into the endless white. For a moment I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the floodlights, tall, thin, impossibly still. I blinked, and it was gone. Sleep became elusive. My dreams were filled with voices, calling me down, promising warmth and belonging. I woke with the taste of metal in my mouth, my heart racing. The others grew quieter, more withdrawn. Conversations trailed off into silence, replaced by wary glances and forced smiles. I caught Dr. Sato staring at the floor, her lips moving in silent prayer. The twins no longer joked. Carter spent hours in the machine shop, tinkering with broken equipment that didn't need fixing. I tried to hold on to routine, to reason, but the depot felt less real with each passing day. The knocking beneath the floor never stopped. The shadows beneath the ice grew bolder, lingering at the edge of sight. And always that voice, my mother's voice, calling me home. Sleep became a rare luxury, and when it came, it was shallow and restless. I'd wake with my heart pounding, convinced I'd heard someone whispering my name, only to find the room empty and the window thick with frost. The days, if you could call them that, grew shorter, the twilight more reluctant. The depot's lights flickered more often, casting long, uncertain shadows down the corridors. We all clung to routine, but the sense of order was slipping. Griggs grew more irritable, barking at us for the smallest mistakes. Lena's hands shook when she poured her coffee, and she kept glancing at the security monitors as if expecting something to appear. The twins, once inseparable, now spent hours apart, each muttering to themselves in their native tongue. Dr. Sato stopped joining us for meals, claiming she was working on a new soil analysis, but I'd catch her staring at the ice through the lab window, her breath fogging the glass. Carter, though, seemed restless in a different way. He volunteered for every task, no matter how menial or unpleasant. When the pressure in one of the outflow pipes dropped, He was the first to grab his parka and headlamp. "I'll take care of it," he said with a forced grin, zipping up his coat. I watched him disappear into the blue gloom, his flashlight bobbing like a will-o'-the-wisp. Time stretched thin. We waited for Carter to return, the minutes dragging into hours. Griggs tried to radio him, but all we got was static. Lena paced the floor, chewing her lip. Eric and Anders argued in the corner, their voices low and urgent. I sat by the window, staring out at the snow, trying not to imagine what might be moving beneath it. When Carter still hadn't come back by nightfall, Griggs ordered us to search. We split into pairs, each taking a different sector of the depot. Lena and I trudged through knee-deep drifts, our breath steaming in the air. The cold was so intense it made my teeth ache. Every sound was magnified: the crunch of boots, the groan of metal, the distant moan of the wind. We found nothing. No footprints, no sign of struggle, not even a dropped tool. It was as if Carter had simply vanished, swallowed by the ice. When we regrouped in the main building, the tension was palpable. Griggs slammed his fist on the table, swearing under his breath. The twins stared at the floor, their faces pale and drawn. Dr. Sato wrung her hands, her eyes darting from face to face. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bunk, listening to the wind rattle the windows and the ever-present knocking beneath the floor. I tried to tell myself Carter would be fine, that he'd just gotten lost or taken shelter in one of the outbuildings. But I didn't believe it. Around midnight, I crept into the control room. The security monitors glowed in the darkness, cycling through grainy images of the depot. On one screen, I saw movement, a figure standing by the fuel tanks, motionless. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was Carter. He was barefoot, wearing only a thin undershirt and boxers, his skin gray with frost. He stared directly into the camera, a slow smile spreading across his face. I recoiled, knocking over a mug. The sound echoed through the empty room. When I looked back, the screen was empty. I rewound the footage, but there was nothing, just static and snow. I woke Griggs and Lena, dragging them to the monitors. They watched in silence as I played the footage again. This time there was only darkness, the tanks barely visible in the gloom. Griggs muttered something about hallucinations, but Lena squeezed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw him too," she whispered. We tried to call Barrow, desperate for help, but the radio was dead. The emergency beacon, our last lifeline, refused to power on. Griggs tore it apart, cursing, but found nothing wrong. It was as if the depot itself was conspiring to keep us here. The next morning, the snowcat wouldn't start. Carter had been the only one who could coax it to life. And now it sat in the garage, silent and inert. We were stranded, cut off from the world by miles of ice and darkness. The depot felt smaller, the walls closing in. The rules we'd clung to now seemed meaningless, powerless against whatever had taken Carter. The knocking beneath the floor grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the empty halls. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound found its way in, relentless and patient. That evening, as the last light faded, I caught my reflection in the window. My face looked strange, unfamiliar, pale and drawn, eyes too wide. For a moment I thought I saw someone standing behind me, their smile cold and empty. I spun around, but the room was empty. We gathered in the common room, huddled together like children. No one spoke. The silence pressed against us, thick and suffocating. I stared at the door, half expecting it to open, for Carter to walk in, smiling that awful smile. But the door stayed shut, and the darkness pressed closer. But the door stayed shut, and the darkness pressed closer. The night after Carter's disappearance stretched on forever. We sat in the common room, the air thick with dread, each of us unwilling to be the first to leave. Shadows pooled in the corners, and the only sound was the faint hum of the heaters struggling against the cold. I found myself staring at the door, half expecting it to open, for Carter to step through, grinning that strange, empty smile. But the door never moved, and the silence grew heavier. I drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, my dreams a tangle of voices and shifting faces. In one, I stood alone on the ice, the depot a distant smudge behind me. The sky churned with auroras, green and violet, and beneath my feet the ice was thin, spiderwebbed with cracks. I heard my mother's voice, soft and inviting, calling me to come home. I tried to answer, but my tongue was heavy and numb, my words lost in the wind. I woke with a start, heart racing, the taste of metal on my tongue. The next morning, I found Lena in the kitchen, staring into her mug as if she could divine some meaning from the swirling coffee. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she flinched when I touched her shoulder. "Did you sleep?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She shook her head, her lips pressed tight. The twins arrived next, silent and pale, their movements stiff and awkward. Eric's hands trembled as he buttered a piece of stale bread, and Anders watched him with a wary, almost fearful gaze. Griggs appeared last, his face drawn and gray. He didn't speak, just poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the end of the table, staring into space. Dr. Sato was absent. I found her later in the lab, hunched over her notebook, scribbling furiously. When I asked if she was all right, she looked through me, her eyes unfocused, and muttered something about patterns in the ice. The depot felt different, as if the walls had shifted in the night. The corridors seemed longer, the doors farther apart. The knocking beneath the floor was louder now, more insistent, and sometimes I thought I heard it echoing from the walls themselves. I tried to ignore it, but it followed me everywhere, a constant, patient reminder that we were not alone. That afternoon, I bundled up and stepped outside, desperate for air that didn't taste of fear and recycled heat. The cold hit me like a wall, stealing my breath. The sky was a flat, endless gray, and the snow stretched out in all directions, unbroken except for the depot's battered silhouette. I walked the perimeter, boots crunching in the crusted snow, my eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of Carter. I found nothing. No footprints, no movement, just the endless, indifferent white. As I rounded the corner of the main building, something caught my eye. A set of tracks, barely visible, leading away from the depot toward the edge of the floodlights. I knelt, brushing away the snow. 2 sets of prints, one larger, one smaller. My heart hammered in my chest. The smaller set matched my own boots. I followed them as far as I dared, stopping where the ice began to crack and shift. The tracks ended at a narrow fissure, a jagged wound in the snow. I stared into the darkness below, the cold radiating up from the depths. For a moment I thought I saw movement, a flicker of pale skin, a glimpse of dark hair. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and hurried inside, slamming the door behind me. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. The others were gathered in the common room, their faces tense. Eric was speaking in a low, urgent voice, but when I entered, he fell silent. Anders stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking. Lena sat in the corner, rocking slightly, her hands clenched in her lap. That night, I woke to the sensation of someone sitting on the edge of my bed. I opened my eyes and saw Carter, his skin gray and mottled, his lips stretched in that awful, too wide smile. He leaned close, his breath icy on my cheek. "It's warm under the ice," he whispered. "Join us." I blinked, and he was gone, the room empty except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. The next morning, the depot was quieter than ever. The twins barely spoke, and when they did, their words were clipped and strange, as if they were reciting lines from a forgotten play. Griggs snapped at Lena for no reason, his patience worn thin. Dr. Sato wandered the halls, her notebook clutched to her chest, muttering about echoes and mirrors. I tried to hold on to routine, but it was slipping away. The rules that had once anchored us now felt hollow, meaningless. The knocking beneath the floor was relentless, a constant reminder that something was waiting, watching. The others grew more distant, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright. I caught Lena staring at her reflection in the window, her lips moving in silent conversation. That evening, as I walked the corridors, I heard laughter, soft, familiar, but wrong. I turned a corner and saw the twins standing together, their faces identical, their smiles fixed and empty. They spoke in unison, their voices overlapping. "It's better this way," they said. "No more cold, no more fear." I backed away, heart pounding, and fled to my room, locking the door behind me. I pressed my ear to the wall, listening to the knocking, the laughter, the whispers. I knew then that we were being replaced, one, by something that wore our faces and spoke with our voices. Sleep was impossible. I lay awake, clutching my blanket, waiting for the next knock, the next voice calling me home. I barely recognized the faces around me anymore. The depot's common room, once a place of forced camaraderie, had become a theater of strangers. The twins moved in perfect sync, their voices blending together in a way that made my skin crawl. Lena's eyes followed invisible shapes in the air, and she answered questions I hadn't asked. Griggs paced the halls, muttering about protocol, but his words had lost their meaning. Dr. Sato drifted from room to room, her notebook clutched to her chest, scribbling symbols that looked more like runes than science. I tried to hold on to myself, to the memory of who I was before the cold seeped into my bones. I clung to small rituals, brushing my teeth, tying my boots, checking the heaters, anything to remind myself that I was still Alara, still real. But even those habits felt hollow, as if I was performing them for someone else's benefit. The knocking beneath the floor had changed. It was no longer random or distant. Now it echoed my footsteps, matched my breathing, as if something below was learning the rhythm of my life. Sometimes, when I stood alone in the corridor, I felt a pressure in the air, a sense of being watched by eyes that didn't blink. One afternoon, desperate for answers, I rummaged through the depot's archives. The records were a mess. Water-stained logbooks, brittle maps, yellowed photographs of crews long gone. Most of the entries were mundane, but every few years there were gaps, pages torn out, names crossed off. I found faded Polaroids of men and women standing in front of the tanks, their faces blurred by age or perhaps something else. In the margins, someone had scrawled a warning: "Do not trust the ones who return." I dug deeper, ignoring the chill that crept up my spine. One folder contained incident reports from decades ago. Words like missing, unexplained, and replacement appeared again and again. There were sketches of figures beneath the ice, drawn with a shaking hand. The last entry was a single line. They are patient. They wait for the thaw. I slammed the folder shut, my hands trembling. The truth pressed in on me, cold and heavy. Whatever haunted this place was older than the depot, older than any of us. It had been waiting, watching, learning, and now it was hungry. That evening, I confronted Griggs. He stood by the window, staring out at the endless white. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We can't stay here." He turned, and for a moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Fear, or perhaps something colder. "There's nowhere to go," he replied. "The ice is part of us now. We belong to it." Lena appeared in the doorway, her face slack, her eyes unfocused. "It's warm below," she murmured. "No pain, no fear, just peace." The twins flanked me, their movements eerily synchronized. "Join us, Alara," they said together, their voices overlapping. "It's easier if you don't fight." I backed away, heart pounding, searching for an escape. Dr. Sato blocked the hall, her notebook pressed to her chest. "You're the last one," she whispered. "Don't make it hard." Panic surged through me. I bolted for the garage, fumbling with the snowcat's keys. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them standing in the doorway, their faces blank, their smiles too wide. The depot's lights flickered, casting long shadows across the snow. As I tore away from the building, the radio crackled to life. Voices spilled from the speakers, some familiar, some not, calling my name, pleading, cajoling, promising warmth and belonging. I turned the volume down, focusing on the path ahead. The tundra stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. The snowcat's headlights cut a narrow path through the darkness. The landscape shifted around me, familiar landmarks twisted into new shapes, the horizon bending in impossible ways. I gripped the wheel, fighting the urge to look back. The rules that had governed our lives, never go outside alone, keep the heaters running, trust the routine, were nothing but lies. They had kept us complacent, docile, ready for whatever waited beneath the ice. As I sped across the frozen wasteland, the knocking faded, replaced by a new sound, a low, mournful hum that vibrated through the snowcat's frame. I pressed on, desperate to outrun the voices, the memories, the cold certainty that I was already changing. I didn't know if I was escaping or simply running in circles, but I refused to stop. Not yet. Not until I knew for certain whether I was still myself, or just another echo in the endless white. The snowcat barreled through the endless white, engine roaring against the hush of the Arctic night. I gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, afraid that if I let go, the machine would simply vanish beneath me. The depot's lights faded behind me, swallowed by the swirling snow, leaving only the narrow tunnel of my headlights to mark the way forward. The world outside was a shifting blur, the horizon warped and uncertain, as if the land itself was trying to confuse me, to turn me back. The radio, which had been silent for so long, now crackled with static and fragments of voices. Sometimes I heard my own name, spoken in tones that twisted between pleading and mocking. Other times, the voices overlapped, a chorus of familiar and unfamiliar, Griggs, Lena, my mother, even Carter, each urging me to stop, to come home, to rest. I turned the dial, desperate for silence, but the voices only grew more insistent, weaving themselves into the mechanical hum of the snowcat. I tried to focus on the landscape, to chart a course toward Barrow, but the landmarks I remembered seemed to shift and dissolve. A line of fuel drums I'd passed on the way in now stood half-buried and warped, their shadows moving against the snow in ways that made no sense. The sky was a bruised purple, the auroras flickering and pulsing like veins beneath the skin of the world. The cold pressed in from all sides, seeping through the seams of my parka, biting at my face and fingers, making each breath feel like inhaling broken glass. At one point, the snowcat's headlights caught a figure standing alone on the ice. For a moment, I was certain it was Carter, barefoot, smiling, his skin a shade too pale. I swerved, heart hammering, but when I looked back, the figure was gone, leaving only a swirl of snow in its place. I pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine protesting, the treads biting into the ice. The further I drove, the stranger the world became. The snowcat's dashboard flickered, the dials spinning erratically, the fuel gauge dipping and rising with no logic. I passed a cluster of abandoned equipment that looked familiar, yet wrong. Rusted shapes twisted into unfamiliar angles, their surfaces slick with a frost that seemed to pulse with light. My own reflection stared back at me from the windshield, eyes wide and unblinking, mouth stretched in a smile I didn't remember making. Sleep pressed at the edges of my mind, heavy and seductive. I fought it off, slapping my cheeks, forcing myself to stay alert. The voices on the radio changed, growing softer, more intimate. My mother's voice, gentle and warm, promised that everything would be all right if I just stopped fighting. She told me I was tired, that it was time to come home, to rest beneath the ice where it was safe and warm. I shook my head, tears freezing on my cheeks. I wasn't ready to give in, not yet. I forced myself to remember the rules, not the depot's rules, but my own. Keep moving, don't listen, don't look back. I repeated them like a mantra, clinging to them as the only thing that still felt real. The snowcat's headlights flickered, then died, plunging me into darkness. I slammed the brakes, heart pounding, and fumbled for the flashlight in the glove compartment. The beam cut a narrow path through the snow, illuminating only emptiness. I stepped out, boots crunching on the ice, breath steaming in the air. The silence was absolute, a living thing pressing against my ears. I walked a few steps from the snowcat, shining the light in all directions. The landscape was unbroken, endless, but I felt eyes on me, watching from just beyond the reach of the beam. I spun in a slow circle, searching for movement, for any sign of life. The cold seeped into my bones, numbing my fingers, making my thoughts slow and heavy. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted, a low groan reverberating through the ice. I staggered back, nearly losing my footing. The fissures in the snow widened, dark cracks spreading out in all directions. For a moment, I thought I saw faces in the ice, pale and indistinct, their mouths moving in silent laughter. I stumbled back to the snowcat, slamming the door and locking it behind me. The radio hissed, then fell silent. I stared at my reflection in the windshield, searching for some sign that I was still myself. My eyes looked strange, too bright, my skin tinged with gray. I pressed my fingers to my cheek, half expecting them to sink through the flesh. I started the engine, the snowcat lurching forward. The world outside twisted and warped, the horizon bending, the sky pulsing with unnatural light. I drove on, desperate, the voices fading into the distance, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a weight on my chest. I didn't know if I was getting closer to Barrow or drifting further away, lost in a landscape that no longer obeyed the laws of nature. All I knew was that I couldn't stop, not yet. Not while there was still a chance to escape whatever waited beneath the ice. The snowcat rattled on, its engine's growl the only defiance against the vast, indifferent cold. I watched the horizon for any sign of Barrow, but the world had become a labyrinth of shifting white and shadow, the boundaries between earth and sky dissolving in the endless twilight. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, the ache in my knuckles spreading up my arms, as if the cold were burrowing beneath my skin. I tried to focus on the dashboard, but the dial spun uselessly, the numbers meaningless. My breath fogged the glass, and I wiped it away, only to see my own face staring back, pale, drawn, eyes too bright. For a moment, I didn't recognize myself. The smile that flickered across my lips felt borrowed, a gesture learned from someone else. The radio crackled again, but now the voices were quieter, more distant. My mother's voice drifted in and out, promising warmth, forgiveness, belonging. I pressed my palms to my ears, desperate to block her out, but the words found their way through the cracks in my resolve. "You're almost home," she whispered, "just a little further." I blinked hard, fighting the pull of sleep. The snowcat's headlights illuminated a wavering path, the snow swirling in hypnotic patterns. I forced myself to remember. Barrow was north and west, the depot far behind me. But the landmarks had all shifted, the world rearranged itself while I wasn't looking. I passed a cluster of twisted metal, half buried in the drifts, and realized with a jolt that it was the same abandoned loader I'd seen hours before. I was moving in circles, the landscape folding in on itself. Panic clawed at my chest. I slammed my fist against the dashboard, willing the world to make sense. The pain felt distant, muffled, as if I were wearing gloves made of ice. I glanced at my hand and saw a patch of skin flake away, revealing something gray and smooth beneath. I jerked my sleeve down, heart pounding, refusing to look again. The silence pressed in, thick and absolute. I became aware of a strange sensation, a humming, deep and resonant, vibrating through the snowcat's frame and into my bones. It was the same sound I'd heard beneath the depot, the same patient rhythm that had haunted my dreams. I pressed my forehead to the steering wheel, fighting the urge to let go, to surrender to the cold. A flicker of movement caught my eye. In the rearview mirror, a figure stood in the snow behind the snowcat. Tall, thin, impossibly still. I turned, but the world outside was empty, the only footprints my own. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, its face obscured by shadow. I blinked, and the face resolved into my own, lips parted in a silent laugh. I started to shake, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that spread through my body. I tried to remember the depot, the faces of my crew, the sound of their voices, but the memories slipped away, replaced by the echoing promise of warmth beneath the ice. The rules I'd clung to felt childish now, meaningless in the face of whatever I'd become. I pressed on, the snowcat lurching forward, the world narrowing to a tunnel of white and gray. My reflection in the windshield smiled back at me, calm and patient, eyes shining with a light that was not my own. I reached up to touch my cheek, and another patch of skin came away, drifting to the floor like a snowflake. I understood then. There was no escape, no return to the world I'd left behind. The thing beneath the ice had learned my face, my voice, my memories. It wore me as easily as I wore this parka, this name. I was a vessel, hollowed out and filled with something ancient and cold. The snowcat shuddered to a halt, its engine dying with a final, reluctant sigh. I sat in the silence, watching my reflection in the glass, waiting for the last pieces of myself to slip away. The cold no longer hurt. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding calm. Somewhere in the distance, I heard voices, familiar, welcoming, calling me home. I stepped out into the snow, leaving the warmth of the cab behind. The sky above was a tapestry of shifting lights, and the ice beneath my feet hummed with promise. I walked toward the horizon, my reflection leading the way, and the last of my memories faded into the endless, waiting white. The silence welcomed me, and I smiled back,